They're the version of hitting bottom that no one warns you about. It's not dramatic. It's not a single explosion that destroys your life in one blow. It's quieter than that. It's losing everything one small piece at a time, until one day you look around and realize the life you built is gone. And worse, you're not even sure you recognize the person standing in the wreckage of it. That was him, 34 years old. No job, no relationship, a bank account that made him flinch every time he opened the app, and a mirror he had stopped looking into because the man staring back had become a stranger he didn't like very much. This is the story of how that man, broken, humiliated, and completely out of excuses, became unstoppable. Not because life got easier, because he did. Part 1: The Fall. 3 years earlier, he had everything that looked like success from the outside. A good job in sales, a relationship of 6 years, a rented apartment in a decent part of town, friends who called him the guy who always figures it out. But underneath the surface, cracks have been forming for a long time, the kind of cracks nobody sees because we're all too busy performing the version of ourselves that looks fine on the outside. He drank more than he should have. Not enough to call it a problem. That's what he told himself. Just enough to numb the parts of his life he didn't want to feel. He avoided hard conversations. He avoided responsibility. He avoided the version of himself that required discipline, because comfort was easier, and easier had always worked out fine before. Until it didn't. The company he worked for restructured, and his position, the one he'd coasted on for years without ever really growing his skills, was the first to go. 6 months later, his relationship ended. Not in one dramatic fight, but in the slow, painful realization from both sides that he had stopped showing up as a partner long before she stopped showing up as one. He moved into a small room in his older brother's house. 34 years old, sleeping in a room with boxes he never fully unpacked, because unpacking them would have meant admitting this was his life now. He told himself it was temporary. Everyone tells themselves that. But months passed, and temporary became a word he used to avoid confronting a permanent truth. He had built nothing that could survive contact with hardship because he had never built anything on discipline. Only convenience. Part 2: The Bottom. Rock bottom doesn't always look like a single moment. Sometimes it looks like 100 small humiliations stacked on top of each other until the weight becomes unbearable. For him, it was a Sunday afternoon. His brother, trying to help, had asked him gently, without malice, "What's the plan, man? You've been here 8 months." It wasn't cruel. It was fair. It was a question he had been avoiding asking himself for 8 months, and hearing it from someone else finally broke through the fog he'd been living in. He didn't have an answer, and in the silence that followed, something inside him finally cracked all the way open. That night he walked. No destination, just movement, because sitting still meant sitting with thoughts he couldn't outrun anymore. He walked past his old office building, dark and empty on a Sunday night. He walked past the restaurant where he'd had his last dinner with a woman he used to love. He walked until his legs ached, and somewhere in that ache, an old memory surfaced. He remembered being 22 years old, fresh out of college, Absol. Part 3: The Decision. He didn't go home that night and write some grand manifesto. Real transformation rarely starts with poetry. It starts with something much smaller, much rawer. He went back to his brother's house, sat on the edge of the bed in that cluttered room, and made himself one simple, brutal promise. I will not lie to myself anymore. About anything. No more calling laziness resting. No more calling avoidance processing. No more calling the drink at the end of the night just relaxing. He decided, right there, that every excuse he made from that point forward would be examined under one unforgiving question. Is this true, or is this comfortable? The next morning, he woke up before his brother's family, before the sun, and he did something he hadn't done in over a year. He made his bed. It sounds insignificant. It is not. That single act, disciplined, deliberate, uncomfortable in its earliness, became the first domino. Because rock bottom teaches you something most comfortable people never learn. Change doesn't begin with the big things. It begins with proving to yourself, in the smallest possible way, that your word to yourself still means something. He made his bed. Then he went for a walk. Then he wrote down, on the back of an old receipt, 3 things he was going to do differently that week. Nothing extravagant. Wake up earlier. Apply to 5 jobs a day. Stop drinking, even just for 30 days, to see who he was without it. Small, unimpressive, unphotogenic, but real. Part 4: The climb begins. The first week was brutal in a way that had nothing to do with physical difficulty and everything to do with facing himself without the numbing agents he'd relied on for years. Without alcohol, his emotions came back sharp and unfiltered. The shame of his situation hit him fully for the first time, not dulled, not softened, just raw. There were nights he sat in that small room, fists clenched, fighting the urge to walk to the nearest STO. By the end of the first month, he had 30 days without a drink, the longest stretch in over 5 years. He had applied to over 100 jobs. He had read more books in 30 days than he had in the previous 3 years combined, because in the silence where alcohol used to live, he had discovered an appetite for learning he didn't know still existed inside him. He got a job, not the job of his dreams, an entry-level position, a fraction of what he used to earn, work he would have considered beneath him 3 years earlier. He took it without hesitation, because rock bottom teaches you humility, and humility is the foundation every real comeback is built on. Part 5: Rebuilding brick by brick. He rented a small studio apartment. Nothing impressive, barely furnished, but his. The first thing he did in that empty apartment wasn't decorated. It was write a single sentence on a piece of paper and tape it to the wall by his bed. Discipline first. Everything else follows. He built a routine with the precision of a man who had learned, the hard way, what happens when routine is absent. Up at 5:30 a.m. Exercise, not for aesthetics, but to prove to himself daily that he could do hard things before the world even woke up. Reading for 30 minutes before work. Working the entry-level job with an effort that surprised even his new employers, because he no longer had the luxury of coasting. Coasting was what had cost him everything the first time. Months passed. He got promoted. Not dramatically, just one small step, the reward for showing up consistently in a way most people don't. He started saving money. Small amounts, but consistent, because he had learned that consistency, not intensity, is what actually builds a life. He paid off the debts that had haunted him since the fall. Slowly, the numbness of survival began to give way to something he hadn't felt in years: momentum. But the real transformation wasn't in his bank account or his job title. By the end of the first month, he had 30 days without a drink, the longest stretch in over 5 years. He had applied to over 100 jobs. He had read more books in 30 days than he had in the previous 3 years combined, because in the silence where alcohol used to live, he had discovered an appetite for learning he didn't know still existed inside him. He got a job, not the job of his dreams, an entry-level position, a fraction of what he used to earn, work he would have considered beneath him 3 years earlier. He took it without hesitation, because rock bottom teaches you humility. And Part 6: The setback. No comeback story is a straight line, and his wasn't either. A year and a half into his rebuild, he faced a moment that nearly unraveled everything. His new company, the one he'd worked so hard to prove himself in, went through layoffs. He was let go, not because of poor performance, but because of decisions far above his control. The old version of him, the one from 3 years earlier, would have seen this as confirmation of every fear he carried. Proof that trying doesn't matter. Proof that the universe simply wasn't on his side. But he wasn't that version of himself anymore. He sat with the news for one night, allowed himself to feel the disappointment fully, without numbing it, without running from it. And the next morning, he did what he had trained himself to do for 18 months straight. He got up at 5:30 a.m. anyway. He exercised anyway. He opened his laptop and started applying again. Not from a place of desperation this time, but from a place of proven capability. Because he now had 18 months of evidence that he could rebuild from nothing. Losing the job hurt, but it no longer had the power to define him, because he had already proven to himself, in the hardest way possible, exactly who he was underneath circumstances. This is the quiet difference between someone who has merely improved their life and someone who has become genuinely unstoppable. It isn't the absence of setbacks. It's the refusal to let setbacks reset your identity back to who you used to be. Within 6 weeks, he found a better position than the one he'd lost, a direct result of the skills, network,